In the spring of 1936, every wheat field in a 12-mile radius of my grandfather's farm turned to dust and blew into the sky. His didn't. The government sent men out to find out why. He told them. They wrote it down, filed it, and nobody ever heard about it again. My name is Earl Pruitt. 3 generations on the same ground in the Texas Panhandle. My grandfather built a farming system on this land that needed nothing from the chemical companies, nothing from the seed corporations, nothing from the government. It survived the Dust Bowl when everything around it failed. It's still running now. In 1971, a man named Earl Butz, Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, former board member of Ralston Purina, told every family farmer in America 3 words: get big or get out. In the decade that followed, 400,000 family farms disappeared. My grandfather kept doing exactly what he'd always done. Every farm around him was gone. He was still farming the day he died. What I'm going to show you is the exact system that made that possible. 6 components, each one replaced on purpose, each one still running on this land. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe before we start. No sponsor, no product. Just 40 years of watching what this specific piece of ground does when you don't let them tell you how to farm it. The first component is what everything else depends on, and it's the one they came for first. Before the seed companies arrived in force in the 1950s, every Panhandle wheat farmer saved seed from his strongest stalks every August. Not randomly. Specifically. The stalks that stood up best in wind. The ones that produced something in a dry year when the neighbors' fields were burning up. The ones that showed disease resistance on that exact plot of ground. You were breeding your wheat to your specific soil, your specific rainfall pattern, your specific wind, year after year, decade after decade, until the seed and the land were the same conversation. The variety my grandfather grew was Turkey Red, brought to the Great Plains by Mennonite settlers from Russia in 1874, deep-rooted, drought-hardy. By 1935, it had been learning this specific ground for 60 years. It knew how to be thirsty in a way no catalog seed ever has. Then the hybrid companies arrived with a better offer. Higher yields per acre in good years, more moisture, more fertilizer, more chemical input required, but higher numbers on paper in ideal conditions. The government's per-bushel subsidy structure rewarded maximum yield, not drought resilience. Farmers who switched to hybrids outproduced their neighbors in wet years. In dry years, the hybrids produced nothing. Turkey Red produced something. Then, in 1970, the Plant Variety Protection Act gave seed companies intellectual property rights over new varieties. Farmers who saved seed from protected varieties faced lawsuits. The system that had worked for generations, select your best stalks, save the seed, plant it next year, became legally untenable overnight. Not because it stopped working, because someone figured out how to own the alternative. His seed knew this soil, 80 years of knowing it. You can't buy that in a catalog. They made sure of that. This is the foundation. Without seed selection, the rotation that kept his soil alive couldn't function. Without the rotation, the moisture conservation had nothing to work with. The components connect, and this is where the connection starts. My grandfather never planted the same field 2 years in a row. 3-year cycle, wheat, grain sorghum, fallow, then back to wheat. That rotation was standard practice on Panhandle farms before 1938, not because anyone told farmers to do it, but because anyone who'd farmed this land for more than a decade understood what happened to ground that never rested. The fallow year wasn't empty. That's what most people misunderstand. The fallow year was doing the hardest work in the entire system. Left unplanted for 12 to 18 months, the field accumulated moisture that 2 seasons of crop roots would have consumed. The previous year's stubble broke down slowly, feeding the soil microbes that made the next crop possible without purchased fertilizer. Organic matter rebuilt itself. The biological infrastructure that chemical farms now have to buy in a bag, nitrogen, phosphorus, microbial activity, the fallow year produced it for free. Farmers who ran this rotation consistently maintained soil organic matter levels that modern chemical farms have since depleted by 50 to 60%. That's USDA NRCS data. Their own measurement of what happened to the soil when the rotation stopped. Then came 1938. The Agricultural Adjustment Act began paying farmers per bushel produced. Any acre left fallow was an acre not earning a government check. The rotation that had sustained this land for generations became financially impossible overnight. Not banned, just made economically invisible. You were leaving money on the table every unplanted acre. Most farmers stopped within a few years. My grandfather kept rotating. He was leaving money on the table by the government's accounting. His soil kept producing. The farms that took the check started dying slowly, not in one season, but across decades, as the organic matter declined and the inputs required to compensate increased every year. The government paid him not to rest his land. First year he understood what that meant. He said, "They're not trying to help us. They're trying to own us." The rotation kept the soil alive. The soil kept the moisture, and the moisture, in a region that averages 12 to 18 inches of rain a year, was the whole game. My grandfather never once pumped water onto a crop in his life. Before Ogallala irrigation became cheap and widespread in the 1950s, Panhandle farmers ran a complete dryland moisture conservation system. 3 techniques working together so tightly that removing any one of them reduced the effectiveness of the other 2. The first was dust mulching. Immediately after any rain, even a quarter inch, even a passing shower, you worked the top 2 to 3 inches of soil into a fine powder within 24 hours. That layer broke the capillary channels that pull moisture from the subsoil to the surface, where the panhandle air evaporates it within days. Below the mulch layer, moisture stayed locked. Farmers who did this consistently could grow winter wheat on 12 inches of annual rainfall without a single irrigation pump. The second was stubble retention. After wheat harvest, you left the cut stalks standing rather than plowing them under immediately. Standing stubble caught blowing topsoil and trapped snow in winter, and the residue broke down over summer, adding organic matter back into the ground. The Dust Bowl destroyed farms that had plowed their stubble clean. Farms that retained it lost dramatically less soil. The third was contour strip cropping, alternating strips of wheat and fallow ground, oriented perpendicular to the southwest wind. The fallow strips created friction at ground level that slowed the wind before it could lift topsoil. The Soil Conservation Service documented soil loss reductions of 65 to 90% on stripped fields compared to continuous cropping and field trials from the 1930s and 40s. 3 techniques: no equipment beyond what was already on the farm, no purchased input of any kind, total cost, knowing what to do within 24 hours of a rain. Then cheap Ogallala irrigation arrived and made moisture conservation feel unnecessary. Why dust mulch a field when you can pump water? By the 1970s, most panhandle farmers had abandoned dryland techniques entirely. The Ogallala would last forever. The engineers said so. The USDA now reports that some panhandle counties have lost over 50% of the Ogallala's saturated thickness. The aquifer that replaced this system is running out. The system that didn't need the aquifer was abandoned precisely when it was most needed. Every drop of rain that fell on this land, my grandfather kept. The neighbors were pumping the Ogallala dry. He was watching it fall and keeping every bit of it. In 1921, my grandfather planted a line of Osage orange trees along his north and west fence lines. The government's Prairie States Forestry Project, the official shelter belt program, didn't begin until 1935, 14 years later. Between 1935 and 1942, the federal government planted 220 million trees across the Great Plains and took credit for saving the topsoil. The farmers who survived the Dust Bowl with minimal loss had often already planted. Osage orange was the Panhandle choice for specific reasons. It grows dense, low, and thorny. Cattle won't push through it. It produces no commercial value. The fruit is inedible, so there was never any temptation to remove it for a better use. A properly planted shelter belt reduces wind speed at ground level by 50 to 60% for a distance of 10 to 15 times the tree height. It reduces evaporation from the field behind it by 20 to 30%. It reduces topsoil loss in ways that no tillage practice alone can replicate. That line of Osage orange my grandfather planted in 1921 is still standing. It is over 100 years old. It has protected this land through every drought, every duster, every hard wind the Panhandle has produced in a century. It has never once asked me for anything. Then farm consolidation arrived. When farms get absorbed into larger operations, fence lines disappear, shelter belts get pushed out to plant more acres. Large equipment needs large unobstructed fields. The USDA estimates the Great Plains has lost over half its original shelter belt coverage since the 1970s as farm size increased, following Butz's Get Big or Get Out mandate. The trees that took decades to grow came out in an afternoon. The wind that they'd been holding back for 50 years came back within a season. He planted that tree line for land he'd never see in its full maturity. He planted it for me. I've never touched it. That's what thinking in generations looks like. It's a different relationship with land than the quarterly earnings model ever produced. Every field on this farm has always carried a strip of grain sorghum, not as a cash crop, as insurance. There's a difference, and my grandfather understood it precisely. Sorghum's root system goes 5 to 6 feet deep against wheat's 3. In drought conditions severe enough to kill a wheat crop, sorghum goes dormant instead of dying. It stops growing, pulls back, waits. When the rains return, it resumes. Wheat doesn't do that. Wheat dies and stays dead. In 1934, the wheat failed across most of the Panhandle. The sorghum produced. In 1936, same story. In 1939, same story. Every time the primary crop failed, the backup was there. Cattle fed through winter. Family fed through winter. The farm survived to plant again the following September. As farms consolidated and specialized in single-crop wheat for government subsidy programs through the 1950s and 60s, the sorghum strips disappeared one by one. The subsidy was for wheat. The check was for wheat. The equipment was optimized for wheat. There was no financial structure that rewarded keeping a backup. One crop, one failure point, no redundancy anywhere in the system. Then a dry year came, and the wheat burned, and there was nothing to fall back on. That's not a farming problem. That's what happens when you optimize a system for profit in good years without accounting for what it does in bad ones. Every field had its sorghum strip. That wasn't extra work. That was the difference between a hard year and a catastrophic one. They talked farmers out of it by making wheat the only crop the system rewarded. When the dry years came, and in the Panhandle they always come, there was nothing left to fall back on. The sorghum strip is still on every field on this farm. It has been there since my grandfather put it in. I have never considered removing it because I have never forgotten what it's for. No element of this system worked without the people around it. Harvest crews rotated between farms. A man came to your harvest, you went to his. Equipment was shared across operations that couldn't individually afford everything the season required. A family hit by a bad year, a hail strike, a sick herd, a failed well was carried by its neighbors until the next good one. No money changed hands, no score was kept. The labor returned somewhere else the following month. The Last Man Club, the mutual support network of Panhandle farmers who chose to stay through the Dust Bowl years, wasn't a social organization. It was an economic one. Shared labor, shared knowledge, shared seed, shared equipment. The farms that survived the 1930s at the highest rate were farms operating within strong mutual networks. Not the biggest farms, not the best capitalized farms, the most connected ones. When cash and consolidation replaced community exchange after World War II, that network dissolved. When one farm bought its neighbors out, the community that had sustained both disappeared with the fence lines. The system required people. The industrial model replaced people with capital and called it efficiency. 6 families worked this harvest for 40 years. Nobody paid anybody. When one family had a bad year, the others held them. I've watched that system disappear in my own lifetime, not because it stopped working, but because the economic structure that replaced it made hiring feel cheaper than owing. It wasn't cheaper. It was just easier to measure. Here is what the USDA's own data shows happened to the land around this farm after each of these components was replaced. Panhandle topsoil organic matter has declined an estimated 50 to 60% on conventionally farmed land since the 1940s. The Ogallala Aquifer has lost over 50% of its saturated thickness in some counties. Average American farm size went from 155 acres in 1935 to 444 acres today. In the decade after Earl Butz issued his directive, 400,000 farms disappeared. In the 1980s farm crisis, the direct consequence of the debt Butz's policy required farmers to take on more than 300,000 additional farms were foreclosed. Every number in that list is USDA data, their own accounting of what their own policy produced. This farm's soil still has the organic matter it had in 1940. We have never drawn from the Ogallala. We have never taken out a loan against this land. We have never signed a seed contract. We have never purchased a chemical fertilizer. The farm next to mine has been under chemical management for 60 years. You can tell the difference by looking at it from the road. The color is different. The structure is different. The way it moves in the wind is different. The land doesn't lie. It never has. They buried this system because it didn't need them. No chemical company, no seed contract, no government subsidy check that came with strings attached. No irrigation pump drawing down an aquifer they don't own. A farm running this system is a farm they cannot sell to, cannot control, and cannot foreclose on when the price they set for your crop doesn't cover the debt they encouraged you to take on. That's why Earl Butz told your grandfather to get big or get out. That's why they replaced open-pollinated seed with hybrids that won't reproduce true. That's why the 1938 Agricultural Adjustment Act made fallowing financially impossible. That's why they let the Shelter Belt program die when the farm consolidation started pulling the trees out. They needed you to need them. My grandfather didn't need them. This farm doesn't need them. And if you're watching this, you're already asking the question they spent 50 years trying to make sure you never thought to ask. The system is still here. It still works. The soil is still alive. The trees my grandfather planted in 1921 are still standing. The sorghum strip is still on every field. The rotation is still running. I'm going to keep documenting every piece of it, not because I think one channel changes what happened, because the men who carried this knowledge are almost gone, and when they go, it goes with them, unless somebody writes it down. Keep your roots in the ground. And